Hello everyone. Today let us find out what is value or tonal value when it comes to painting. That is how we practically understand what tonal values to use when we are painting any subject. For example, I have taken here a pink rose. This pink rose is the tutorial which we will be doing for December. And I will just share my camera so that I can have a better view. And what value is, or what tonal value is, means the lightness or darkness of any color, which will allow us to get a 3D form in that subject. And with respect to this flower, what do we understand? We understand what is the darkest dark that we can see. It is in here, here. The darkest darks are also over here, little bit over here, and in some other places. Now we must also understand what are the lightest lights, which is this area. This section, which is in the light area, is the lightest lights, along with some others, which is here and here. What does it tell us? It tells us that the source of light is somewhere coming from this end. When it is coming from this end, the light is directly falling over here. That is why we say that this is the lightest light, as well as on some of these petals. So besides finding our darkest darks and the lightest lights, we also need to find what are the mid values. The mid values are those which are in between these lights, lightest lights and the darkest darks. Okay, these are some of these. Okay, some of these over here, some over here. Okay, this is how if we can put down all the lightest lights, darkest darks, and the mid values, the mid tonal values of this flower on the paper in the shapes in which we can see it, we will be able to have an image, a painting, which will look very much realistic. So practically, what do we do? Practically, you can take a black and white image or a grayscale image of the same so that you can understand where exactly is your dark. Now here is what I see is the darkest area. Here is another. Here is the third, the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh area, and a little bit over here as well. So with the help of a grayscale image, you can even check it out on your mobile phones by putting the thing on a grayscale mode. Then you can see where you need to go, very dark, very light, and you can even find the mid-tones, which is very much required so that we have a similar painting as we see on now. You can use any of your colors. You can even use green as long as the tone. Okay, so the color is relatively less important. What is important is to place our values in the shapes in which we see them. Thank you.
We begin with the second part of our rose painting. Now the majority of rose we have covered, and today's tutorial is important because we will learn a lot about observation, because we have to now find our mid values and values which are lower than that, most of the mid values. So finding the mid values is relatively tricky because we have to train our eyes into finding them. So what we need to have is our reference image right in front of me. Mine is open on another device so that I can see the values clearly, and the values that I see is what values I will use for the rose, be it in any color. So here I'm creating some small shapes. As I can see, I'm using my magenta color here. I'm mostly using Daniel Smith colors. You can use any of the artist grade colors because they will go a long way, and you will have very rich paintings if you use them, which will be lasting for a long time. They will not fade away. At this place on my rose, I am creating a shadow. In fact, I have already created it. What I am doing is that I am darkening that shadow area with a concentrated mix, relatively concentrated mix of my colors. I have right now mixed slight bit of red because I have it. In order to go slightly darker, you can even mix tiny little tiny spot of green into your majority being the red or pink, whatever colors you have for the rose. You can even paint it yellow. If you do a yellow rose, you can use lemon yellow as well as new gamboge. Those two colors will suffice. So let's come back to the pink. Right now what I'm doing is I'm darkening the darks that I see on my reference image, and I'm placing similar values at places where I see them. So my observation has to be very focused right now so that I can create the right kind of images through the brushwork. Here it is relatively lighter, so I am using that kind of value, which is the pigment being diluted with water. In this area I see that the reference is relatively darker, so I am using little bit of red mixed with pink. So when I'm if I'm shuffling between red and pink, I'm not exactly washing the colors. I'm using my brush without washing them, without washing the colors. So I'm trying to locate where the shadows are again, and what shapes can I see in those shadows. See, these curvy shapes are here. It's looking too much, so I'll take it off. It is not mandatory for us to put on each and every mark according to what is there on the reference image, but we cannot tamper with the crucial images and crucial shapes which there are on this rose. So if any shape is crucial to forming this rose, you will try to incorporate it. Wetting down this area, because here I see that it is kind of wet on wet. Pulling down what the lighter values. I'm just taking some more color, very pale color I have taken. I'll go darker than this, but we'll wait for the next layers. What I observe is what I paint, and that is why I'm taking different consistencies. Different consistencies meaning it is mostly a pale consistency of colors which I'm using. Color diluted with a lot of water. Only in a few places do we have darks, like in here in the shadow areas especially. Just looking at my reference image to confirm the shapes. There is right now very little paint in my brush, but if I still don't like it, I'll get it off with my tissue paper. Right now I've taken slight bit of magenta. If you don't have magenta, if you have just pink and blue, you can mix the two colors, or you have red, then you can mix a little bit of blue and red for the darkest darks. Right now using a pale consistency for the petal which is folding upwards. There's a slight fold and it is towards the ceiling, towards the sky. So it is quite pale because, as you remember, the sun is coming from top left. This is our first layer, and I will mostly be doing wet on dry in this section because it is a small section. You still can do wet on wet, and but then I would like to do it wet on dry. Here I am going in with a darker color to create the shadows. Looking at the reference image and working as per my line drawing. These are the first few layers. At least 3 layers will be required for this flower. So I'm trying to get my shapes correct. I just mixed some purple and some pink in a lighter consistency. Purple again. I'm trying to look at the shapes which are there in the reference image. Here I am just removing the hard line edge with a damp brush. Again, darkening the shadows. Why I need to keep darkening the shadows is in my first layers, when I even put a pale wash of pink on any of the areas and the surrounding area is white, you can see the difference between the two colors. But as I start layering and as I start putting colors for the other petals, you will not be able to distinguish between one petal and the next if you do not darken the previous one. That is why as we start to do the next few layers of our petals, we also need to darken the shadow areas or the petals beside that. and this is a mostly wet on dry, which is what I'm doing in this top section. So it will not be very difficult. Even if you do not get the exact shapes, you need to understand what the shapes of a rose would be, or you can look at a few pictures or your reference image if you have it, and accordingly make your marks. Pale pink in here, and outlining slightly the shadow areas. Now I'm using very less water on my brush. The consistency of paint you can see is there on the palette. I'm using, because I have perylene maroon, so I'm using a thin consistency of perylene maroon to darken the darkest darks of this rose. But if you don't have, you can use pink and blue or red and blue. Many people don't have pink, so red and blue if you're using, you can mix a bit of the two and create your darkest darks. Here I've just dropped a blob of color, so I'm taking that extra water and paint off with my dry brush. Now on, we are just doing just using a relatively damp and dry brush and using very little paint on our brush. To create marks which are in the mid value region, and to create the shapes which we can see. You saw there is hardly any paint and water on the brush. Still I'm using it because it is of use for the place at which I did. If you have red, you can dilute it, like you can create a tinted consistency, which is 1 drop of paint in about 24 to 30 drops of water, and with that tinted consistency you can use it for this brushing, doing some sort of dry brushing, because the brush right now hardly contains any paint or water. So I have got some Windsor violet, so I'm using that. If you do not have, you can use some blues, but again there is hardly any water and hardly any paint on the brush. minimalistic it is. Again darkening some of the darks, because this area needs to look a bit, it needs to have its darks also, so that the thin and smaller petals which we can see can be seen clearly. That is why we need to add the darks in some of the crevices. This is the petal that's going outside, from its curving from the inside and moving towards the outer side, towards the top and the outer side. So we need to shape it accordingly. Just putting in a layer of water, because the paint is looking like blobs. So I'm putting in some water and with a dryer brush taking that extra water off. With a tissue, again extra water off. Creating veins. Here I'm looking at the image so as to understand how dark I can go. This rose looks like a winter rose. See, it is getting its shivers and the veins can be seen. Here I put in some more color, so I'm just taking it off by mixing that color with my damp brush into the body of the rose. Here we need to darken, because after having put the surrounding colors for the petals, this area has merged, so we need to highlight what the darks are. Here again tiny C shapes I am creating, very tiny. Creating shadows so that the petals which are bent towards the top can be understood as such once we create the darker shadows. And in this section I am not using a lot of water, very less water am I using. It's almost dry brush, so I am taking my paints very quickly. Previous layer over here had dried, so I'm darkening it with another layer. This time I'm using violet, so the darks can get more prominent. Even though I'm using violet, it is a pale consistency. And this is the shadow area we need to create. I like that part which I just did. Even this one, I like the shadows because they help pop up the rose. Be careful with the edges over here. Okay, now the shadow. This rose is almost done. I'm mostly trying to put in the darkest darks wherever it is required. That is why I'm using a pale mix of my Winsor Violet. There is some more red on the other side if you can't see the screen. But all the mixes that I'm using are pale because we are using the layering method. Here I'm using some reds in the lower part, creating curve-like shapes. If you have any difficulty working out any of the areas, please do let me know. Or with regard to what colors you can use, what values should be used. You can contact me through email, or if you are on my Facebook, or through Facebook Messenger. Facebook Messenger is a different app. Okay, now here again I'm putting in some reds because I want to add some darker values over here. If the petal on top is completely facing the sun, just below that where there is no sunlight reaching has to be darker. So I'm using darker values of perylene maroon.